Jeremy, this first question is for you. Do consumers want legislation, do you believe, that curbs this distracted driving concept? They see other drivers as kind of the problem, not themselves. You know, we talked about that a lot this morning. What's your perspective on that in terms of legislation?
Well, I think that's a good question. So we talked earlier about social acceptability, response bias, and I think there's probably surveys out there where consumers are reported to be perhaps favoring legislation, but I think in the states that have tried that, we've seen that in most of those cases, the accident rates actually went up because what happened is the behaviors that the legislation was designed to eliminate actually just went underground, or actually under the dash in the case of texting while driving. I think the consumers figured they could get away with it perhaps if it wasn't quite so obvious. So I personally tend to favor more in the way of a much more broad-based, I guess, educational campaign. I think it goes to what I was talking about earlier in terms of us being responsible drivers. And that's pretty hard to legislate. I think that's something that we have to do because we're more aware of the risks. And at the end of the day, I don't think there's any easy answers to that.
David, I'm curious as to Microsoft's role in this whole issue of distracted driving. Obviously, you're being asked by the OEMs and the suppliers to do more and more relative to technology in vehicles. What has Microsoft done in terms of infrastructure to address that issue?
Really, we leave that up to the OEMs as far as what comes into the vehicle. We provide sort of the underlying platform. But it is interesting. I don't know if you saw in that last clip, you saw the use of Connect, which is our controllerless application for gaming. A lot of the OEMs are very interested in that technology itself to aid maybe with a sleepy driver or to detect a driver, it's his vehicle, unlock the door. And so, we started in the in the head unit in the platform, with the platform, but people are seeing other applications with our different technologies.
Geoff, just a question about infrastructure in terms of education. How do you foresee those infrastructure problems getting in the way of the students and some of the new ideas and technologies that they bring forward? Do you see that as an issue or not?
I think that infrastructure has to be as much part of the view of transportation designers as the products that are designed to run on the infrastructure. Particularly, I think it's highly likely that certainly in this part of the world we're unlikely to see much investment in new infrastructure in any big way, so we have to make much better use of what we've already got. And I think that as we educate our young transportation designers, they need to be very mindful of those sorts of facts. So I don't see a separation between infrastructure, for instance, roads or rail networks or whatever it is. I don't see much separation between that and the vehicles or products that run on them in the mindset of the future transportation design.
Jeremy, how can automakers best balance consumer demands? You talked about this just make it work, and the challenges that present in making mid-cycle product changes. How do they balance some of those?
Well, I'm trying to think how that question actually balances, So we're talking about technology that just works, and we're dealing with like the 2-year mid-cycle update?
Right, so they have to do mid-cycle changes or they're doing large changes. How do they balance the demands of the consumer that says, I just want to make this work, and all of the new technology that they want to put into vehicles and the changes coming there?
Well, I think it might have been your presentation that actually dealt with this, but I think one of the ways to deal with the different cycle times, and the technology cycle times are a matter of weeks just about, versus the auto companies' cycle times, which are at best every 2 years there's a refresh, is to sort of separate out sort of the software layer, if you will. So you've got the hardware in the vehicle, which is going to be very difficult to update, but you can certainly add new functionality, even the sync, which has gotten hit around a little bit in terms of some of the kludginess of the interface. They're going to be issuing a software update to that for vehicles that are already in the marketplace. And that's kind of a new idea. With our computers and our phones, they get updated all the time. But the idea that your car actually gets updates is going to have to be pretty much on the software side. using those updates to help the car stay more current with some of the expectations which are evolving at a pretty rapid clip in terms of what consumers are asking their vehicles to actually provide. I think it's really separating out the hardware and then relying more on a software layer that can be more sensitive to the need for rapid updates.
A couple questions about emerging markets and where we see the automotive industry growing. And I guess, David, I want to first ask you, as it relates to intellectual property and new technology and things that are going on, obviously there's a lot of discussion about what goes on in emerging markets and the use of other people's technology. Can you talk a little bit about not only what you see in the industry, but how does Microsoft even manage some of that in terms of intellectual property?
No, that's a huge ongoing struggle for us. You see it in the papers all the time. And, it's very hard to govern. That's the best way I can say it, is that, you want to make sure that people license your product and that, that as they deploy those licenses, they have correct counts within their company, and that's something that we always struggle with. And in where all the growth is, really in China and Asia, that's an even tougher environment for us.
Well, and continuing along that theme in terms of emerging markets, for Jeremy and for Geoff, both of you, just your thoughts on what is that, when you look at the emerging markets, what will technology be like in those markets? Do you see it as being different, similar? And Geoff, maybe you can comment on some of the differences in those emerging markets as it relates to design and education of those differences in technology.
I don't think, it seems that if you look at, for instance, the emerging Asian economies, which have now a huge appetite for consuming the same kind of transportation products as we have been for a long time, clearly there isn't an awful lot of difference in the technology involved nor the expectations. Where I think that there has been both, and I'm speaking less as an educator now and more as just an observer of the future of transportation, where there is both a disappointment but nevertheless an opportunity, is that here in the developed economies, we have a very set idea about the way things have been done and the way we think things should be done. And certainly our friends in China or India or Indonesia probably know as much about those technologies as we do. On the other hand, they don't have such embedded ideas as us. So the disappointment is that in some ways that they have not taken the opportunity of learning from our mistakes and leapfrogging to something better and smarter when it comes to transportation or cars. But on the other hand, maybe they will be much less. They'll be much less resistant to change as practicality demands it. So, I think there are a lot of people who are very skeptical here about the future of electric vehicles or hybrids or whatever. That's what the Chinese and the Indians and the Indonesians and Brazilians are buying at the moment. They're buying the same kinds of vehicles as us, but as reality changes, I think they'll be much more ready to take a leap of faith in new technologies than we are. So that could be an opportunity.
Jeremy, any thoughts on new and emerging markets in terms of connectivity and trends and technology?
Yeah, I think in some ways echoing what we were just hearing, that in many ways the needs of the consumer have sort of a universal aspect, but I think there's different nuances to it. For instance, if you go to Japan, the population is aging very rapidly. Some of the countries in Europe, the populations are aging very rapidly, and I think one of the sort of more optimistic views of technology, we're talking about the risks with things like distracted driving, but on the optimistic side of the ledger, I think technologies can help enhance the skills of drivers so that we're performing at higher levels, even though as we age, perhaps our physical abilities aren't quite at the peak that we would like them to stay at. So you're going to see that sort of evolving in the different markets, I think, in ways that's consistent with as different as the population balances in the market is different. So it may look like there's differences, but it's really, I think, more of the differences in demographics and how these different things are being adopted, the pace that they're being adopted.